always loved a good question. That's why The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel grabbed my attention. If we haven't met yet, hi, I'm Shannon, your barefoot librarian. With a degree in Bible and theology and a master's in education, I've spent my career as a librarian, English teacher, and researcher. I'm your personal footnote detective, chasing down sources, testing every claim, and pulling out the insights that matter. Whether it's faith, wisdom, or life's big questions, I geek out on the research so you don't have to. No hype, no hustle, just thoughtful, grounded insights and real conversation. Lee Strobel is interesting because he wasn't a preacher, he wasn't a theologian, and he certainly wasn't looking for faith. He was an investigative journalist for the Chicago Tribune, an atheist with a sharp legal mind trained to ask hard questions, dig for evidence, and follow the facts wherever they lead. And when his wife unexpectedly became a Christian, Lee didn't follow her blindly. He did what he did best. He launched an investigation to prove Christianity false. Armed with skepticism, research skills, and a whole lot of cross-examination, Strobel set out to dismantle the story of Jesus, piece by piece. But the thing about truth, if you follow the evidence honestly, you have to be willing to go wherever it leads. The result? A fascinating, almost courtroom-style investigation. A journey through history, archaeology, psychology, and theology. Strobel interviewed scholars and experts on everything from the reliability of the Bible to the resurrection of Jesus. And now, I want to take you on a deep dive with me through it all. This isn't just for people who already believe, and it's not just for skeptics either. It's for the curious, the question askers, the ones who wonder if faith can hold up when it's put on the witness stand. Together, we're going to walk through the big questions Strobel asked. Did Jesus really exist? Can we trust the eyewitness accounts of his life? Did Jesus actually claim to be God? And what about the resurrection? Is there any evidence for that? I'm not here to convince you of anything. I'm just here to explore the case. Let's begin. Part 1, examining the record. Before Lee Strobel could wrestle with who Jesus claimed to be, he had to answer a more basic but critical question. Did Jesus of Nazareth even exist? It might sound strange to ask, but it's a question that lingers beneath the surface for many modern skeptics. Was Jesus just a religious symbol? A character invented over time? A mashup of ancient myths borrowed from stories and other spiritual traditions? Strobel wasn't willing to assume anything. As a journalist trained to follow evidence, he went straight to the experts. One of his key interviews was with Dr. Craig Bloomberg, a New Testament scholar who specializes in the historical reliability of the Gospels. Bloomberg explained that the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, weren't written centuries after the fact, the way legends tend to evolve. Instead, they were composed within the lifetime of eyewitnesses, people who had seen, heard, and walked alongside Jesus. Most scholars, both religious and secular, agree that Mark's Gospel was likely written as early as 60 to 70 AD, with others following closely behind. Considering Jesus' death was around 30 to 33 AD, these written accounts emerged within a single generation. That's remarkably early by ancient standards. But Strobel didn't stop there. He wanted to know, if you threw out the Bible completely, would there still be any evidence that Jesus was a real person? The answer, overwhelmingly yes. Non-Christian sources from the ancient world mention Jesus of Nazareth. Roman historian Tacitus wrote about Jesus' execution under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Emperor Tiberius. Jewish historian Josephus described Jesus as a wise teacher who was crucified and whose followers claimed he rose from the dead. Even Pliny the Younger, a Roman governor, referenced early Christians worshiping Christ as divine. And what about the common internet myth that Jesus was just a recycled story, a copycat figure borrowed from pagan gods like Osiris or Mithras? Strobel addresses this too. Scholars of all kinds widely reject this claim. The supposed parallels between Jesus and these ancient myths often fall apart under scrutiny. Either they post-date Christianity, or the stories themselves are vastly different in detail and meaning. So why does all this matter? Why should we care whether Jesus was a real historical figure? Because if Jesus was just a legend, his story can be admired but safely ignored. Legends don't make demands on your life. But if Jesus really walked the dusty roads of ancient Israel, if he really taught, healed, and loved, and was executed under Roman authority, then his story becomes a bit harder to dismiss. It moves from fairy tale to historical claim. And that means we're invited, maybe even challenged, to take a closer look at what he said, what he did, and who he claimed to be. And that's exactly what Strobel did next. Once Lee was convinced Jesus was a real person in history, the next logical question was, can we actually trust the stories written about him? Honestly, isn't that where a lot of us wrestle? Maybe you've heard someone say, sure, Jesus probably existed, but the Bible? That's just a bunch of legends people added over time. I get that. I've wondered it myself. But this is where Strobel's investigative background really shines. Because instead of accepting easy answers, either from skeptics or Christians, he went straight to the question every good reporter asks. How reliable are the eyewitnesses? What makes a story credible anyway? In any investigation, whether you're sitting in a courtroom or swapping family stories around a kitchen table, there are certain things that give a story weight. Are the people telling it close to the events? Are their stories consistent, even if told in different words? Do little details feel raw, real, unpolished? Is there anything to be gained by lying, or are they risking everything to tell the truth? Strobel found that the Gospels passed these tests remarkably well. Eyewitness proximity. The Gospels weren't written centuries later like some skeptics suggest. Most scholars date them within 30 to 60 years of Jesus' death, and many believe parts of them preserve even earlier source material, like creeds and oral traditions, circulating within just a few years of the resurrection. Matthew and John were part of Jesus' inner circle. Mark was a close companion of Peter, one of Jesus' closest friends. Luke was like the ancient world's version of an investigative journalist, interviewing witnesses carefully, compiling an orderly account. In other words, these weren't distant legends growing over time, these were stories anchored in living memory. Consistency without collusion. This part really surprised me when I first read Strobel's work. If the Gospels were too identical, it would actually look suspicious, like for people comparing notes to get their story straight. But that's not what we see. Instead, the Gospel writers tell the same overarching story of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, but with natural variations in detail and emphasis. It's exactly what you would expect from authentic eyewitness accounts. Think about it. If you and I watch the same event unfold, a wedding, a family reunion, a car accident, we tell the same story but notice different things. That doesn't mean one of us is lying. It actually strengthens the case that something real happened. Perhaps the most compelling of all of this is the question of motive. The Gospel writers weren't gaining power, fame, or wealth by telling these stories. In fact, for many of them, their testimony cost them their safety, comfort, and even their lives. Who dies for a story they know they made up? As Strobel puts it, liars make poor martyrs. At the end of the day, this isn't just about ancient documents or scholarly debates. It's about trust. Every single day, we choose to trust sources, friends, family, news outlets, experts, not because we witness the events ourselves, but because we trust the people telling us the story. That's the question Strobel had to wrestle with. It's the question I've had to wrestle with too. Are the Gospel writers credible? Did they tell the truth, even when it cost them everything? Part 2, analyzing Jesus. At some point in Strobel's investigation, the question shifts from did Jesus exist to who did Jesus think he was? And honestly, this is where things start to get a little uncomfortable, because most people, if they're being fair, are pretty happy to admire Jesus as a good teacher, maybe even a prophet, a man of peace, someone with radical love and wisdom ahead of his time. But claiming divinity? That's something entirely different. It wasn't enough for Strobel, or for me honestly, to hear other people claim that Jesus was God. The real question is, did Jesus actually say that about himself? And if so, did he mean it literally or metaphorically, like a spiritual guru claiming oneness with the universe? What Strobel uncovered is that Jesus made shockingly direct claims to divinity, but often in ways deeply rooted in Jewish culture, history, and scripture. One of the most striking is his use of the title Son of Man. At first glance, that sounds humble, right? Almost like Jesus is emphasizing his humanity. But Jewish listeners would have immediately recognized this phrase from Daniel 7, a vision of a heavenly figure given authority, glory, and sovereign power. This Son of Man comes with divine authority to judge and rule forever. Jesus also openly forgave sins, something Jews believed only God could do. He accepted worship. He referred to himself as the I Am, the sacred name God revealed to Moses. And over, Jesus placed himself at the center of God's story, not as a messenger about God, but as God with us. The trilemma: liar, lunatic, or Lord. This is where C.S. Lewis, and later Strobel, force us to face the unfathomable logic of Jesus' claims. If Jesus really said these things, if he claimed to be the Son of Man from Daniel's vision, forgave sins, accepted worship, and called himself I am, then the one thing he cannot be is a good moral teacher. Nice guys don't claim to be God. Wise men don't build their legacy on a lie. And ordinary teachers don't accept worship. As Lewis famously said, Jesus left us with only 3 options. He was lying, he was delusional, or he was telling the truth. But what he absolutely didn't leave us is the option to be neutral. Jesus didn't leave us a comfortable middle ground. He claimed too much for that. Option number 1, was Jesus lying? If Jesus wasn't God, but knew he wasn't, then he was lying. But here's the problem with that theory. Everything about Jesus' life runs counter to what we'd expect from a liar, especially one trying to start a false religion. He taught radical honesty. He condemned hypocrisy. He willingly suffered, even died for his claims. People lie for personal gain. They lie for power, money, comfort, safety, but Jesus got none of those. No wealth, no political power, no armies, no escape plan, just a Roman cross. As Strobel writes, it strains logic to think Jesus would endure brutal torture and execution for something he knew was a lie, especially when he could have easily saved himself with a few simple words. Liars don't die for what they know is false, but martyrs die for what they believe is true. And Jesus, he died for giving his executioners. That's not the profile of a liar. Option 2, was Jesus crazy? So if Jesus wasn't lying, was he just out of his mind? That's the next logical question. And honestly, it's a fair one. After all, history is full of people who've claimed to be divine. Cult leaders, mystics, street preachers. We usually don't call them wise teachers or moral leaders. We call them mentally unstable. To address this, Strobel went straight to Dr. Gary Collins, a psychologist with decades of clinical experience, to ask the hard question: did Jesus show any signs of mental illness? Collins' answer? Absolutely not. Mentally disturbed people are often marked by imbalance, irrational behavior, unpredictable mood swings, disconnected thought patterns, or difficulty relating to others. But when you look at the life of Jesus, he was remarkably clear-headed, emotionally healthy, compassionate but never out of control, strong but never manipulative, wise, consistent, and deeply rational. As Collins puts it, Jesus was the opposite of a madman. He was loving but didn't let his compassion immobilize him. He was in control of his emotions. He cried at the death of his friend Lazarus, but he didn't lose control. He got angry at injustice, but it was a righteous anger. His actions and relationships were healthy and balanced. In other words, Jesus doesn't fit the psychological profile of someone who's delusional. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't unstable. He wasn't disconnected from reality, which means if he wasn't lying and he wasn't crazy, we're left standing face to face with his claims. The fingerprint evidence. Did Jesus, and only Jesus, fit the Messianic profile? It's one thing to claim to be God. It's another to have evidence line up behind you. This is what Strobel calls the fingerprint evidence. The idea that throughout the Old Testament, God left a prophetic fingerprint only the true Messiah could match. Enter Louis Lapidus, a Jewish scholar with degrees from Talbot Theological Seminary, and a former skeptic who grew up dismissing Jesus as irrelevant to Jewish faith. But when Lapidus finally investigated the Hebrew scriptures for himself, something surprising happened. The prophecies didn't vaguely point to someone, they pointed specifically to Jesus. Lapidus walked Strobel through just a few of the over 300 Messianic prophecies written centuries before Jesus was born, including being born of a virgin, Isaiah 7:14, being born in Bethlehem, Micah 5:2, coming from the line of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and David, Genesis 12:3, Numbers 24:17, and Jeremiah 23:5. He would be rejected, Isaiah 53:3. He would suffer and die, Isaiah 53. He would be pierced, Psalm 22:16, and Zechariah 12:10. And he would rise from the dead, Psalm 16:10. Okay, what are the odds? Strobel highlights the staggering mathematical odds of one person fulfilling even a handful of these ancient prophecies by chance. Peter Stoner, professor emeritus of science at Western College, calculated that the odds of one man fulfilling just 8 of these prophecies is 1 in 10 to the 17th power. That's a 1 with 17 zeros behind it. To visualize that, cover the state of Texas in silver dollars 2 feet deep. Mark 1 coin, blindfold a person, tell them to find it on the first try. That's the same chance of anyone other than Jesus fulfilling these prophecies. Lapides conclusion: if Jesus isn't the Messiah, then there never will be one. Admiring versus believing. And honestly, this is where it gets personal. I think a lot of us are comfortable admiring Jesus. We like the parts of his story that feel inspirational. We love the call to love our neighbors, care for the poor, and extend forgiveness. But believing he's divine, that's something different. Because if Jesus really is God, then we don't get to edit him down to fit our preferences. We don't get to cherry pick the teachings we like and toss the ones that challenge us. It means surrender. It means trust. It means a decision. And as Strobel's investigation kept unfolding, he had to wrestle with that decision too. Part 3, researching the resurrection. Can a rational person believe in miracles? I think this might be the question that feels the hardest for most modern people, especially if you're wired like I am. Curious, a little skeptical, and wanting things to make sense. Maybe Jesus lived. Maybe he even believed he was God. But miracles? That's a whole different category. This was a huge hurdle for Lee Strobel too. After all, he spent his career digging into crime scenes, courtrooms, and cold, hard evidence. And yet, if Christianity is true, then it doesn't just rest on wise teachings or good morals. It rises or falls on one staggering claim. Jesus rose from the dead. If that's false, then everything Christianity stands on is a lie. As the Apostle Paul said, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. You are still in your sins. And if that's the case, then we're all to be pitied for believing in something that isn't real. But if it's true, if the resurrection really happened, then nothing else matters more. If that's true, Jesus wasn't just a good teacher, a moral guide, or a prophet. He was and is who he claimed to be, the Son of God, the Savior who conquered death, and is the foundation of a hope that changes everything. So, was Jesus' death a sham and his resurrection a hoax? To assess whether Jesus' death was a real historical event, we need to look at the physical evidence, not just theological claims, but medical facts. Was Jesus' death on the cross a hoax, a stage event, or was it as brutal and definitive as it's portrayed in the Gospels? Dr. Alexander Methrel, a medical doctor with a PhD in engineering, provides compelling insight into the physical reality of crucifixion. He explains that the brutal flogging, the crucifixion itself, and the piercing of Jesus' side with a spear were all fatal blows. The process of death by crucifixion was excruciatingly slow. And the physical suffering Jesus endured wasn't just some dramatic narrative, but a sequence of medically documented events. Here's the breakdown of what we know medically. Jesus was flogged to the point of severe blood loss, which would have caused extreme physical weakness. The cross itself wasn't just a tool of torture, it caused respiratory failure. The way Jesus was nailed to it, with his arms spread out and his legs nailed to the vertical beam, made it incredibly difficult for him to exhale. To breathe, he would have had to push himself up using his nailed feet, but every movement was excruciating. Over time, exhaustion would have made it impossible for him to breathe, causing asphyxiation. Then, when the Roman soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, the gospel writers report that blood and water flowed out. Medically speaking, this suggests that Jesus' heart had stopped beating and fluid had begun to accumulate around his heart and lungs, a sign that Jesus' heart had stopped, confirming that he was truly dead. The crucial point here is that Jesus' death wasn't just a fainting spell or a near-death experience. He was thoroughly and medically dead, with no chance of recovery. The Roman soldiers, who were experts in execution, confirmed this by their actions. They didn't break Jesus' legs because he was already dead. So the question arises, if Jesus was that thoroughly dead, could he have simply woken up 3 days later in the tomb, having faked his own death? Dr. Methrel makes it clear that such an idea is medically implausible. The suffering Jesus endured and the medical certainty of his death leave no room for a mere resurrection by natural means. Jesus did not survive a torturous execution. he was truly dead. And if he was truly dead, the resurrection story can't be dismissed as a hoax. No one could have survived what Jesus went through, and there is no plausible medical explanation for his resurrection. Was Jesus' body really absent from his tomb? Next up in the investigation is a critical question. Was Jesus' body really missing from the tomb on the third day? To answer this, Strobel brought in Dr. William Lane Craig, a prominent philosopher and theologian who examines the evidence surrounding the empty tomb with a meticulous historical lens. Dr. Craig points out that the evidence for the empty tomb is remarkably strong, not just because Jesus' followers said the tomb was empty, but because his enemies couldn't produce the body either. Remember, Jesus wasn't buried in some unmarked, forgotten grave. He was laid in a known, accessible tomb, donated by Joseph of Arimathea, a well-known member of the Jewish council. Everyone knew where it was. And this wasn't just any burial site. The tomb was sealed with a massive stone, likely weighing between 1.5 to 2 tons, and guarded by Roman soldiers. By the way, these were not your average night watchmen. Roman guards were highly trained and operated in units of 4 to 16 men. Falling asleep on duty wasn't just frowned upon, it was punishable by death. Their lives were literally on the line guarding this grave. So, for the body to go missing, you're looking at one of two scenarios. Either the Roman guards failed catastrophically, which is historically unlikely, or someone somehow overpowered them, moved the stone, and stole the body. That someone would have had to have been the disciples. The same disciples who scattered in fear when Jesus was arrested. The same men who hid behind locked doors, terrified for their lives. These were not the type of guys to plot a grave robbery against armed guards. They were in no condition, emotionally or physically, to pull off something like that. And yet, despite all of this, the guarded tomb, the heavy stone, the terrified disciples, the body was gone. No one could produce it. Not the Romans, not the Jewish leaders, and that simple, stubborn fact demands an explanation. So let's say for a moment the tomb really was empty. The next question we have to ask, did anyone actually see Jesus alive afterward? Because an empty tomb by itself could mean a few things, but multiple credible appearances of Jesus after his death, that changes everything. Dr. Gary Habermas, one of the leading scholars on the resurrection, points out that we're not just talking about 1 or 2 isolated reports here. The evidence for Jesus appearing alive after his crucifixion comes from early, widespread, and consistent sources, both biblical and non-biblical. We're told he appeared to Mary Magdalene, to the disciples, to individuals, to small groups, to large crowds, even over 500 people at one time, as Paul records in 1 Corinthians 15. And here's what's critical. Paul basically challenges his readers, go and ask them. Many of them are still alive. That wouldn't be a smart thing to write if it wasn't true. These appearances weren't vague ghost stories or distant visions either. People talked with Jesus, touched him, ate with him. This was a physical, bodily resurrection, not just a spiritual experience. And perhaps most compelling of all, these appearances radically changed people. The same disciples who ran away in fear suddenly were boldly proclaiming that Jesus was alive at great personal cost. Many were beaten, imprisoned, even killed for refusing to deny it. And let's be honest, people might suffer for something they think is true, but nobody willingly dies for something they know they made up. But what about hallucinations? Some have argued, well, maybe all these people just thought they saw Jesus. Maybe it was grief or stress or a kind of mass hallucination. But here's the thing, hallucinations don't really work that way. Dr. Habermas points out that hallucinations are individual experiences. They happen in a person's own mind. They're not group events. You don't have 500 people having the same hallucination at the same time, saying they heard and saw the same thing. That's just not how hallucinations behave psychologically. Plus, hallucinations don't eat breakfast with you, they don't talk back, they don't cook fish over charcoal fires on the beach. And even if you somehow tried to argue that every single person who saw Jesus after his death was hallucinating, you're still left with the awkward fact of the empty tomb. Hallucination doesn't explain that. What about the circumstantial evidence? Okay, so we've looked at the medical evidence of Jesus' death, the empty tomb, and the eyewitness reports of seeing him alive afterward. But there's another layer to this investigation that we can't ignore, the circumstantial evidence. In any good court case, circumstantial evidence matters. It's the big picture stuff, the clues and ripple effects that point to what really happened. And according to philosopher Dr. J.P. Moreland, the circumstantial evidence surrounding the resurrection is powerful. Think about it. Why did the early disciples suddenly become so bold, willing to face torture and death for their claim that Jesus was alive? These were the same men who scattered in fear when he was arrested. Something changed them. Why did skeptical people, like Jesus' own brother James, suddenly become followers? James didn't believe Jesus was the Messiah during his earthly ministry, but after the resurrection, he became a leader in the early church and was eventually martyred for his faith. And what about Saul of Tarsus, who later became known as Paul? The guy who hated Christians and actively persecuted them. What could possibly cause a man like that to completely change his life, claim to have seen the risen Jesus, and become the most influential missionary in church history? There's also the radical shift in worship practices. Jewish believers, who for centuries were fiercely monotheistic and devoted to the Sabbath on Saturdays, suddenly began worshiping Jesus as God and gathering for worship on Sunday, the day of his resurrection. That didn't happen because of wishful thinking. Something had to spark that change. Now, consider another important piece of circumstantial evidence. Who were the first witnesses to Jesus' resurrection? Women. In the culture of that time, women's testimony wasn't considered reliable in a legal context. So if the gospel writers were fabricating the story, they likely wouldn't have chosen women as the first people to see the risen Jesus. This detail is far more likely to be an unintentional truth than a convenient invention, which strengthens the case for the credibility of the resurrection account. It all adds up. The circumstantial evidence doesn't prove the resurrection like a math equation, but taken together with the medical facts, the empty tomb, and the eyewitness reports, it paints a picture that's hard to ignore. As Dr. Moreland puts it, the resurrection of Jesus is the best explanation for the facts we have. Miracles or myths? At the end of the day, this was Strobel's realization. The resistance to miracles isn't about evidence, it's about worldview. If we believe in advance that miracles are impossible, we'll explain away anything. But if there's a God who created the universe, who designed gravity, time, life itself, then suspending those laws occasionally for a purpose isn't irrational, it's consistent. Honestly, that landed hard for me. I don't believe in miracles because I'm gullible. I believe in them because I think the resurrection of Jesus holds up to scrutiny, historically, medically, psychologically. But I also believe in miracles because life is more than just facts and figures. Faith isn't the opposite of reason. Faith is reason with room for wonder. From skeptic to believer. What changed Lee Strobel? As much as Lee Strobel approached his investigation to the resurrection with the sharpest tools of legal reasoning, what ultimately convinced him was not the evidence. It wasn't the dates, the manuscripts, or the arguments. It was the person of Jesus. Strobel's journey was a gradual one, a process of shifting from head knowledge to heart transformation. For most of the investigation, he was trying to build a case, seeking evidence to refute Christianity and rescue his atheism. But somewhere along the way, something unexpected happened. He found himself increasingly confronted with the person of Jesus. The questions he couldn't deny. Who is he really? And why does this man's life and death still matter today? This wasn't just a matter of intellect anymore. His questions became existential. His investigation moved from, is this true, to, could I accept it as true? And somewhere in the quiet, searching moments, Strobel's heart had to wrestle with that. The domino effect of faith. One of the most powerful elements of Strobel's journey was the influence of his wife, Leslie. As Strobel was investigating Christianity, his wife had already become a believer. He was the skeptic, and she was the one praying for him, holding on to faith even when he ridiculed it. Strobel admits that he was hostile toward her faith at first, but over time, he saw how it transformed her. Her kindness, peace, and joy were different. Something had changed in her, and that change began to rub off on him. Leslie's faith wasn't just a quiet presence in their home, it was a dynamic force, one that drew Strobel into the conversation, whether he liked it or not. It was her steadfast belief that first made him look beyond the arguments to something deeper. The domino effect of that transformation was profound. As Strobel began to examine the evidence, it didn't just lead him to intellectual conclusions, it sparked a personal change. His wife's faith led him to reconsider everything, and it eventually spilled over into their family. Their children witnessed the journey too, seeing a transformation that was not just about facts and figures, but about a complete shift in worldview and a new foundation for life. Faith isn't blind, and it was never meant to be. One of the things I love most about this whole investigation and about Christianity itself is that we're never asked to check our brains at the door. Biblical faith isn't about ignoring evidence or avoiding hard questions. It's not about wishful thinking or a blind leap into the dark. Real faith is trust, but trust built on truth. Christianity isn't fall apart under investigation. It welcomes it. It invites curiosity. It makes space for doubt. And honestly, that matters to me because I've never wanted a faith that couldn't handle real life. I've never been interested in fragile beliefs that only work if you never ask questions. But what I've seen through history, evidence, and reason is that Christianity isn't at odds with science or logic. It actually aligns with them. We were never expected to take these claims blindly, not about his life, his death, or his resurrection. There is evidence, there's reason, and there's room to wrestle. That's why, for me, for Lee Strobel, and for so many people, faith usually doesn't happen all at once. It's a journey, a series of steps, sometimes bold and obvious, sometimes small and quiet, sometimes marked by questions, sometimes rooted in a peace you can't quite explain, but always an invitation to keep asking, seeking, and discovering the truth for yourself. As we wrap up this deep dive into the case for Christ, we've seen Strobel's meticulous investigation into the evidence for Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. But beyond the facts, the real question is, what's your verdict? What doubts remain for you? What evidence did you find most compelling? And what would it look like to pursue truth with the same rigor Lee Strobel did in his investigation? If any of this sparked your curiosity, I've linked the book below so you can explore it further on your own. It's a great resource if you want to dive deeper into the interviews and evidence that shape Strobel's conclusions. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. Whether you're skeptical, seeking, or have already made a decision, drop a comment or send me an email with your reflections. Let's continue this journey of discovery together. That's all for now. Take care, stay curious, and I'll see you next time.